Hi everyone. Welcome. You can tell this is a crew of educators after a long day right before winter break. I hope you had some nice, not coming over here. Hope you had some nice kind of quiet contemplative time before we get started. My name is Eleni Sidarius. I'm the director of middle school here at the Gateway School.
Hi, I'm Christy Brackhausen. I'm the director of lower school here at the Gateway School.
And Gateway is a school that serves students grades K to 8. I'll fix this before we continue. Probably start without the mic until we get that fixed. Gateway is a school, this is my teacher voice! Gateway is a school that serves students grades K to 8 who are bright and have language-based learning disabilities and attention deficits. And our faculty and staff are trained in supporting those students. And so tonight you're here to learn a little bit about executive functioning. We're so glad that you've joined us. Try again. Is this better? Yeah. Great. Thank you. So before we get started, I want to introduce our presenters for this evening. We have Dr. William Harrison. He's our middle school psychologist. Elian Seidel is a curriculum specialist and head teacher in our middle school. Valerie Rapel is a learning specialist in our school. And Erica Palazzo is a curriculum specialist and head teacher in our lower school. So they're really going to do all the work today. We're just here to say hello and welcome. What else do we want to check in on? Oh,
Let's see who we have here in the room. Raise your hand if you're currently working in a school. If you're working in early childhood. Elementary, middle school,
woo.
high school. Great. Wayne.
Yeah. Want to come on up?
Hi, I'm Wayne Tam. I'm the CEO of Selective. We're the co-host of this event. It's cool to see some familiar faces here. We have workshops throughout the year around professional development, job search process as part of our platform on Selected. So for those who don't know who we are, we're an online matching platform for teachers and schools if it's for jobs. So if that sounds like a dating app for teacher jobs, it is. And so our mission is really to help teachers find great fits, great ideal school fits based on things like school culture, teaching philosophy. You follow a profile, you answer questions about what you're looking for in a school, and schools like Selected and many other schools throughout the Northeast and now Los Angeles would reach out to you to connect directly for jobs. And so I just want to express my gratitude to Lenny and Christy for co-hosting this event with us. We've been, very early on, great partners, and appreciate this opportunity, so thanks again.
Thank you. And we are going to get started, but for anybody who didn't hear before, there's Wi-Fi over here, username, guest, password, admissions with a capital A, and the bathrooms are right around that corner down the long locker hallway if you need those. And take it away, Dr. Harrison.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I was contemplating starting with a joke, but terrible jokes. So we'll just get started. Right, no more the dog ate my homework, developing executive functioning skills to foster independence. And I think I'm going to loosely define executive functions as a set of goal-oriented skills used for solving problems, both big and small. Right? A set of goal-oriented skills used for solving problems, both big and small. So that's probably going to be my working definition going forward. I'll let you take in this comment for a while. Now this is strangely validating to me. Strangely validating to me because that's literally been me a time or two. And I would imagine it's been you guys, well, some of you guys for a time or two in your lives. But it really drives home the point that to-do lists don't solve problems. To-do lists don't in and of themselves accomplish tasks, right? Accomplishing tasks or accomplishing a goal is dependent on abilities and skills, right? A set of abilities and skills. So something to keep in mind. So because this is a presentation for educators, we thought it fitting to include an aim and agenda for this evening. I won't call anyone to read it, I'll just read it myself. Aim to examine teaching of executive function skills agenda items. Number 1, identify parts of the brain and explain how they impact executive functions. Number 2, identify important concepts about executive functions. 3, utilize executive functions. And 4, discuss how to build executive functions through classroom instruction. So that's going to give us a little direction. And again, since this is a presentation on executive functions, this does serve as a tool to get us really structured and ordered as we proceed this evening. All right. So whenever you talk about executive functions, you have to start with the brain, right? And the cerebral cortex in particular, which is the outermost part of the brain. And again, if you looked at a skull, that's the first part of the brain you would see, that wrinkly section. And it's divided into 4 lobes, where the temporal lobe is right here, typically by the ear. And in the back is the occipital lobe. On the top is the parietal lobe. And this is the section that we want, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is really the housing for executive functions. In particular, the prefrontal cortex. Now, even though the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe house executive functions, they have connections to other areas of the brain. So they're pulling information from other areas of the brain for some purpose. So that's something to keep in mind. And in particular, the prefrontal cortex is the source of things like decision making. So how do you decide between choices? Using logic, using reason. Planning ahead, thinking about future goals, setting future goals. Social behavior, what's appropriate and what's not. Also, social awareness and self-awareness originate there. And inhibition, putting on the brakes or using a filter. Both using a filter with incoming information, so figuring out what needs to get in, and also with outgoing information, what needs to get out, what you need to say in particular situations. Okay, now what you have in front of you is a list of typical executive functions. It's not an exhaustive list because, again, some people would add other abilities and skills as well, like reasoning and logic. You could add. Some people add verbal fluency there. So there are a bunch of other things that you can sort of add to this list, but this is a good, solid list of executive functions. And in particular, this planning and goal setting. So this is really when we're thinking about accomplishing some goal, and it's also clarifying what we want to do. So it's how we plan a strategy, and also it's how we actually think about accomplishing those goals. Whether you're accomplishing several goals along the way to get to the big goal, or if you're starting with the big goal. Organizing materials, organizing behavior, all in the service of accomplishing a goal. Prioritizing, sort of keeping in mind what steps go when. Shifting flexibly. What do you do when you get sort of stumped? Do you continue to sort of push that round peg through a square hole, or do you change strategies? Working memory, being able to keep things in mind as you solve a problem. Self-monitoring, being able to step back and sort of see how you're doing on your way to a goal. Emotional and behavioral control, your ability to control frustration, but also control your behavior while you're on your way to a goal. And I have at the bottom there, selective and sustained attention. Some people think it's sort of automatic whenever you talk about executive functions, you're talking about attentional control, and some people parse it out. So I just did sort of a little bit of both by putting it there, but in parentheses. Because I tend to think of it as something that's just rudimentary to executive functions, being able to control your attention. And now this set of executive functions, these executive functions are going to be used for problems both big and small. Whether I'm solving a multi-step math word problem, or I'm trying to get out of the house in the morning for work, or I'm trying to plan a birthday party, I'm going to really use all of these skills to accomplish those goals. I mean, and it's easy enough to see how that fits. So, for example, if I'm working on a math word problem, planning and goal setting, planning how am I going to attack this thing, and goal setting. What am I trying to get out of this word problem? Organizing. Is there a way to do this? Is there a formula to do this? How am I going to, again, proceed with attacking this problem? Prioritizing, which steps go first. Shifting flexibly. If I'm starting to go down the wrong path, can I stop or do I keep going down that path? Working memory. Being able to hold information in mind as I'm going through the word problem, because if I'm going through a word problem and I keep forgetting the problem or keep forgetting what I'm working on, that sort of really slows down my learning pace. Also, self-monitoring. How am I doing on the task? Is that moment where you sort of step back and sort of try to check how you're doing in that moment. Emotional and behavioral control. Emotional control. If I'm getting frustrated, do I just rip up my exam in tantrum, or can I sort of just tough my way through it? In behavioral control, am I able to regulate my behavior? Am I able to sit in a classroom or sit during a test long enough to complete the test? So again, these can be used very easily. That set of skills that we were looking at before can be used very easily in the classroom setting, but it's also skills that we need, again, for the everyday, those everyday things that we have to do, whether it's, again, getting to work, finding gateway after, at the end of a day, all those goals that we need to accomplish in a day, those are the skills that we use to accomplish them. Now, when we have weak executive functioning, you'll notice that there are very sort of real everyday problems that tend to crop up. So, carelessness. Again, if my self-monitoring is weak, I may act carelessly. Or if I'm not acting in an organized manner, I may act carelessly. Slow learning pace. Again, if I have a poor working memory, and again, I'm working on a word problem, if I have to keep going back to the problem as opposed to working it out, it's going to sort of waste time. Especially, this really catches up with kids on timed exams. Forgetfulness. Again, that can be attached to organization as well as attention. And disorganization, often losing things, very messy, that sort of speaks for itself. Problems navigating to destinations. If you have a poor visual working memory or your mental map, if you have a poor mental map, you're going to have lots of difficulty getting to where you need to go. And again, in the school setting, I would imagine that you guys see this, some of these things all the time. Problems initiating or stopping tasks. You can have problems on both ends, whether it's getting started on something or whether it's stopping when you need to stop, when it's time to transition. Haphazard trial and error strategies. If you're not working in an organized manner, you're probably going to be trying one of these strategies to get through whatever problem you're facing. Talking or laughing at inappropriate times. Again, issues of self-monitoring come into play here. Saying regrettable things. Those are folks with no brakes and no filters. Restlessness, fidgeting, again, that's an aspect of behavioral control. And increased agitation and lashing out is also an example of both behavioral but also emotional control. So as you can see, weaknesses in executive functioning have very everyday sort of real world consequences. Now what we want to do is we want to take a look at sort of specific executive functions and sort of give you an idea about how they work and what they look like. And this is the Wisconsin card sort test. And there are online versions, and there are actually physical cards that are used for this test. Now, I think we're going to do this as a group. We thought about calling an individual up, but we thought about it again and decided against it. So what we're going to do is maybe do this as a group. So for this task, what we're going to do is we want to match that bottom card with one of the cards on the top, right? We're going to match that bottom card to one of the cards on the top, and that's the only instruction you get. So, in looking at that bottom card and looking at the 4 top cards, who here thinks that number 1 is the appropriate placement for that card? Maybe. Number 2? No. Okay. Number 3? Okay. And number 4? Okay, all right. So let's think a little bit. What are the criteria we're using For those that chose number 2, why number 2?
Quantity.
So, quantity, looking at quantity, number, okay. And for those that chose number 4?
Shape.
Shape, okay. All right. So, and no one chose?
For color.
So, we have some people changing their mind, maybe number 1? Okay, all right. So this is a, should we go one line and actually do it? Yeah, we might have to cut and paste that. So, yeah, I think we actually got to go online and play it for a second.
We're
In
doing
terms
this on
in terms of planning and goal setting, we fell short of
We're shifting flexibly right now, using this in order
all
to.
part of it.
Showing you some of the technology we have available.
We'll get there. Yeah, but we gotta get some feedback. And it's gonna be a right or wrong answer. Oh, that's good. Right, so, let's see, I think the most hands went up for card 2. So, I'm not sure what it's, oh, if you maximize it, maybe. There we go. So card 2, if we can just click, yeah.
Well, that
Oh.
was different.
So try, oh, was it a different card?
Yeah.
All right, all right. So, all right,
Number 4.
let's try another poll then. You know, we got a little sort of feedback. Who thinks it's number 1, card number 1? Okay, there she goes, sticking with color. Card number 2? Card number 3? Okay, and card number 4? I think card 3 has it. Oh, so it's not card number 3 now. So now what we have to remember the criteria that we were using, right? So are we want to match by shape, by number, or by color?
Not by number.
Number didn't work. So we got 2 left, shape and color. So who says number 1? Okay, and number 3? I think number 1.
Yeah, drag it.
I don't think they drag.
Drag the bottom.
Do you drag it up? I don't know if you drag it or not. You just click it. Yeah. No worries. So, in any event, yeah, we don't
We'll never
tell
know.
you. Just leave comments below. No. So typically on this test, you get feedback, yes or no. Your job is to figure out the rule, right? Figure out the rule based on the feedback that you have. And what this test measures is 1, reasoning. How well do you sort of test your hypotheses? And 2, it also looks at flexibility. Because if you keep getting no, again, do you keep trying the same strategy even though it doesn't work or not? And number 3, how well do you do sort of trial and error? How well do you get through the trial and error phase to actually see the rule? So that's what this test really measures. And it was sort of developed in like the mid to late 40s. And it looked at real individuals with brain damage to the frontal lobe. So that's how we know that it really looks at reasoning and all those things that are located in the frontal lobe. So think about this, when a kid is in a classroom, and particularly math comes to mind, if you're not necessarily well versed on the strategy that you're going to use to attack a problem. You got to go through a reasoning process where you sort of are thinking, how do I get through this problem? But you have to sort of pay attention to cues, whether or not you're getting something right or wrong. The next slide. So this is another test called the Stroop effect test. Now typically you would have probably maybe 4 or 5 times as many colors written up there, but your job in this test would be to read the color, to tell me the color of the ink and not the word as fast as you can. So as you read it quickly, your brain is going to want to read the word because we're trained to read words since we were very, very young. So your job is going to be to selectively attend to the color and not the word. So it's really a measure of interference and inhibition. But typically what you'll see is people will on the way to finishing they use a lot of expletives usually. Because what happens, once it comes out of your mouth, you're like, oh! So, again, it's fighting back that urge. So there's an impulse control piece to this, and there's a selective attention piece to this, trying to figure out what's relevant and what's not, but in a sort of doing it quickly. So if the game would have worked, we would have had a better reflection. But again, we talked it through a little bit. In terms of the first test, the Wisconsin card sort, you had to sort of come up with a strategy. What strategy did you want to use? And we talked through three. It could have been color, number, or form, right? So we picked a strategy. And again, if it worked, the test is a little sort of tricky because once you sort of get what they're looking for, whether it's color, number, or form, they give you a sign that says yes, you got it, you got it. Then all of a sudden they change it on you. They change it in the middle because again they're looking to see how well you shift. And sometimes people just get stuck in the answer that they're given, and they keep going, even though the feedback is saying no, 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 no. So again, in terms of executive functioning, it can give you a really good look at this idea of perseveration or getting stuck on things. And in terms of the Stroop effect test, that again really looks at how well you're able to sort of manage interference. And then think about a typical classroom setting. How well are you able to listen to the teacher talking and also ignore what's being said around you, ignore what's going on in the hallway, ignore what's going on outside, right? I once had a kid that explained to me so well. He had ADHD and he knows he has ADHD and he knows his ADHD well. He said his experience in a typical classroom is that every sound is played at the same volume and he never knows what to listen to. So he really struggles with selective attention, right? If everything is at the same volume, what do you listen to? So that's whenever I think about sort of selective attention and that Stroop task, that's what I sort of think of. And also, there's this idea of impulse control too. So again, on the Stroop test, your brain wants to read the words, but your job is to put the brakes on.
So I have a question. How do you help students who may have ADD or ADHD develop strong executive functions?
So, as we go through this, you're going to start to pick up some hints about things you can do. Thinking about the places where they're weak, right? Not just attention and focus, but in ADHD, there tends to be lots of deficits in executive functions, the various executive functions. So, there are going to be issues with order and organization. There are going to be issues with not just impulse control, but use of filters. There's going to be problems with prioritizing. There's going to be problems with slowing down and learning to use a reason instead of haphazard or a sort of really non-strategy as opposed to using a strategy. So those are some of the things that you would look at specifically for kids with ADHD. All right. That's it. Yes.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about, now that we know what executive functions are, we're going to talk about how they impact academics. And as you can see from this slide, sort of a summary of just some of the ways that executive functions impact academics. Really, it's across the board. It's in all areas. Not only in terms of students' ability to access content, whether it be language arts content in reading or in a writing class or in mathematics, but of course in things like science and social studies, and additionally in actually accomplishing tasks, completing a homework assignment, studying for a test, completing a long-term project. So we're going to take a look a little bit more in depth, specifically at a mathematics example. You know, in a lot of current mathematics programs, the goal is to take students beyond just arithmetic into mathematics, into more of a problem-solving kind of conceptual place, so that we actually have functionality in life with mathematics. And so, you know, in those types of problems, that's where you begin to see the intersection of the computation with language. So here is an example of a typical word problem that you might see in a mainstream classroom. So there were
I'm sorry.
that's okay. There were 18 children at a party. Some children left the party early. Then 9 children were remaining at the party. How many children left the party early? So this is tricky. The language is a little bit complicated. You really have to be able to visualize and envision what's happening in this scenario. And for students who have weak executive functions, it can be very challenging to figure out where to even begin. How do I begin to attack a problem like this? So at Gateway, one of the things that we do, our first step in our lesson planning, is to really think about analyzing the given task at hand. We can't begin to plan the scaffolds and the supports until we actually think about what are the underlying foundational skills that are necessary to accomplish the task. So this is an example of a template that we might use when analyzing a word problem task as executive functions relate to it. You know, which executive functions are necessary and why, and what is it that each of these things, you know, what do you need to do in terms of each of these different processes. So once we actually fill out the template, it looks something like this. So we might realize that in order to solve a word problem, you need to do a lot of organizing. You have to locate you have to have all of your materials and be organized in terms of your actual workspace. You need to show your work in a logical, sort of organized fashion on the page so that the teacher can follow what steps you took in order to solve the problem. You need to actually follow some steps. In terms of planning, you need to determine what those steps are, manage your time, again, make sure that everything is represented and drawn in a really logical way. As for prioritizing, once you read the problem, you need to be able to kind of wade through the language and figure out what is the most salient information. What are the keywords? What are the numbers? And then use those keywords to help you determine the operation that you'll actually, you know, compute in order to get to the answer. There's a lot of shifting and mental flexibility involved. So you have to not only transition from step to step in a process for solving a word problem, but you actually have to kind of shift set from doing things like reading the problem to computing an algorithm to then actually maybe writing out a solution sentence. There were blank children left at the party. Working memory is a huge one. So in working memory, we need to be able to hold on to all of the different pieces of information that we have, then manipulate some of it and come back and retrieve the information we have yet to use. As an aside from the word problem, this is an example of why you know, automaticity with basic math facts is so important, because when children start to do more multi-digit algorithms like 2x2 multiplication, if they don't remember their single facts, there's a huge working memory kind of demand there to be able to hold on to the facts and then also the procedure. And so the more that we can do to try to alleviate that load, the better able the students will be to access the material. In terms of checking and self-monitoring, all along the way, we need to be thinking about each step of the procedure. Have we done it correctly? Have we completed it? Are we ready to move on? In many cases, teachers require students to check their work, often with an inverse operation. Many students that, you know, we probably all know avoid that step because it just feels like extra work. It's actually helping them to really sort of evaluate their answer. Like, does my answer make sense? Is it reasonable? And that's, you know, yet another piece of, you know, where executive functions come into play. And lastly, there's also the emotional control that is necessary. Students need to manage emotions like frustration if it's difficult, or anxiety around math in general, or, you know, perfectionistic tendencies. They also need to be able to sustain their attention and effort throughout the course of doing the problem. So sort of in summary, you know, the different skills that you need to have in order to attack a math problem like the one we saw, just in terms of executive functioning, are things like setting goals, inhibiting your anxiety, keeping yourself from being distracted by the environment, task initiation, just getting started can be difficult for some students, prioritizing, what should we do first, again, what's that salient information, organizing, working flexibly, monitoring our progress, and managing your time and your emotions. And we have yet to, you know, sort of even discuss the impact of language and processing speed and things like that. You know, just executive functioning alone, you can see the sort of impact it could have on a child's academics. So, in other words, if you were to kind of categorize those things that we just listed out, they fall into two main areas: self-regulation and executive functions. So we know about executive functions that they develop at varying rates, and you know, throughout children's school career, most of them are not fully developed. And for those of you who work with middle schoolers, you may have realized that something like impulse control is actually one of the last to fully develop. But they really are crucial in terms of building, kind of efficiency and functionality in a classroom. So at Gateway, after we analyze the task, as I just showed you, we can then take the next step, which is to plan the supports and the scaffolds that will, again, lessen that mental load and help our students to access the content. So just some examples would be that we might simplify the wording of that word problem. We might give students a scaffolded work page with a checklist of steps where there's a dedicated space for them to complete each part of the procedure. We also have, sort of taken on the project of really analyzing what are all of the foundational skills that go into solving word problems so that we can teach each of them in isolation. And once we've done that, we can then help students to synthesize those individual parts and build back up to the ability to solve a problem start to finish. We sort of affectionately call that our word problem boot camp. So lastly, we also work hard to teach students why the strategies that we teach them work, why they're effective for them, why they're necessary for them, and we work toward helping them to internalize them. So that way, when they go into their next classroom setting in high school, they are armed with a toolbox of skills and strategies that they can then use and apply in their next classroom setting.
All right, so I feel like we've put you up here as a plant, sort of, because you've really guided us to the next part of this presentation. Erica and I are going to spend some time talking with you all about some very specific strategies that we use in lower school and middle school to help students build executive functions. However, really what we're trying to do is to help students build what we're calling gradual independence, right? So we're starting over here at what we consider the teacher-centered phase. This is a really important part of building executive functions. So it requires a lot of very explicit teacher modeling, explicit instruction, and very clear sort of like mini lessons throughout the day that are identifying skills that students are working on and being really explicit and clear about what those skills are. So then the next phase of this would be something that we call teacher-assisted. So what does this look like within guided practice? How does this manifest itself in discussions? But ideally, like end goal over here is what we're calling student-centered. So students are able to take the skills that they're being taught and generalize those skills and then apply them independently within different contexts. So really the goal of a lot of the work that we are doing here is that we're trying to teach students really specific skills to help them with weak executive functions so that when they get into new settings that they can really generalize the things that they've learned. So, to your question, how can you help students build their executive function skills? So we're going to go over a number of different things, including types of explicit instruction and guided practice, what it can look like to think aloud and model positive self-talk, aim and agenda, that's basically like our goals and objectives that we use during each class period, and how we incorporate different organizational tools such as planners and project calendars and timers into everyday instruction to really help students with their executive functions. So, Erica.
Hi, I am Erica Plazo, and just a little aside, when I started at Gateway and learned a lot about these executive functioning skills, I had a lot of self-reflection in what I have learned are my strengths and my areas of weakness. And luckily, I've had some great teachers along the way and colleagues and different people in my life that have supported me to pull upon my strong executive functioning skills and help level it out. So as I'm teaching and I'm going through and looking at my classroom, I'm often reflecting on how do I help myself strategize throughout the day with things that are difficult for me. So that's the lens that I often take on as a teacher. So I am a teacher of some of the youngest learners at Gateway. This is one of our example of our morning routine. So we take nothing for granted at Gateway. We don't expect that students are going to be able to walk through a process such as unpacking easily, because we know that our students may struggle with these sorts of skills. So this is the visual that is posted in my classroom, and some students from the start of the year with just a little bit of explicit instruction are able to put this into muscle memory, but a large portion of the students really need to come back to this. So I would say about every day, my co-teacher and I are often modeling ourselves exactly what we are doing. We're verbally talking through each discrete task. So we go as far as to tell our students where they should place their lunchbox within the cubby to set them up for success. So when they go to take it out for lunch, it's easily accessible. So again, we really do not make assumptions, and we've learned that throughout the year, if we're extremely clear and explicit from the beginning of the year, we have a lot more little guys and little gals that end up towards that student-centered learning, where they're employing strategies to then be able to do this independently. One of the other most important things that I find for my learners is previewing the day. So we go over every day through the schedule, and we often tell the students if there is going to be a change. So we might say, oh, there's going to be something a little wacky today. And tomorrow is picture day, so I'm getting prepped for my big speech. And that reading and writing will look a little different tomorrow. And we've noticed that just going through and telling the students what to expect throughout the day, even if it's different and unpredictable from the day before, they are able to then shift flexibly because they knew it was going to happen. So we didn't throw a curveball at them. We were fair and square, and they really are able to then, with that information, employ the executive functioning skills. So on our end, we just want to make sure that we are lessening any cognitive load for our students who may struggle with these different skills.
So Erica just referenced what a morning routine might look like with some of the younger students, whereas now I'm showing you a variation of what it might look like with some of the older students. You'll notice that there's a shift in the amount of language. We take away some of the visual cues as students tend to get older. But really the big thing here is routine and being very clear with what the expectations are. So this is something that is posted in every single homeroom. We reference it almost every single morning. Again, there are students who come in and they know exactly what to do, but then, and I'm sure you know who the student is in your head who comes in, you're like, it's December, like, take it out, what are we doing here, right? And so something like this here, the way that we've set up this particular checklist is that we've made the action words very clear and very bold, so it's accessible for students and you're using a visual cue for them. So it says something like, okay, you answer the morning message. Then you submit the homework, complete the advisory responsibility, and something like this, again, can help build those types of executive functions because you're building in a routine that students can use when they get into other settings, and we use these types of routines and checklists in almost all aspects of the way that we teach. So having something like this at the beginning, so for instance, I teach middle school, and so my routine at the start of each class is sort of a variation on this, and there's also a routine at the end of the class. So making sure that that sort of consistency is built in can really help some students who have these weak executive functions. So up here is what we call the aim and agenda. So you saw it at the very beginning of the presentation, and now you're seeing it again. This is something that can be used in a classroom that can really set students up for success. So up here we have the aim, so that's really the goal or the objective. So in your classroom this could be, this is the objective for this particular lesson or this particular class period, and you make that really clear. So in this case, identify the effect of British control over the 13 colonies. And then the next piece of it is the agenda, which is really the plan. So here you're helping students understand that when you are completing tasks, there's a goal, there's something very specific that you're trying to do. And so in the case of looking at like a math task analysis, it's like, okay, the goal is finishing the word problem, but how do I get there? And so something like this helps students understand that in order to accomplish goals, you really have to break things down into smaller parts. So each of these particular steps, and I also, here you'll see that you can also utilize other classroom strategies like embedding vocabulary. So what's here in the light blue, the word tension, had been taught in previous days. So you're helping students access information with that repeated practice. The other piece of this that is really important, similar to the routines, is having something like this posted can help students who struggle with that self-monitoring. So if you have a student who is in the middle of a lesson and you're teaching and things are going really well, and then you know the student, they start to drift and they're looking somewhere that isn't the board, or you're noticing that you're starting to lose them a little bit, having something like an aim and agenda is a way that students can then come back into the lesson and access the information, right? So they can self-monitor, oh, okay, we're talking about tension, oh right, we're on the second item of this particular lesson, and now I know we're gonna move through this.
So, paralleling what Elian was just saying, we've got an aim and agenda for the earliest learners as well. It is much more visual just because some of our students are not yet decoding, so we will have a visual paired with the writing. Again, we are emphasizing the action words, so those are the things that we are expecting the students to do. It really, really helps on our aim and agenda to have this sort of checklist. And believe me when I tell you, if we miss a beat, the kids will catch us. So they are constantly monitoring where we are in the lesson. And I found that it really helps in terms of behavior management because the students know what is expected of them. So as you're going through the lesson, you reference back, oh, we're at part 3, we still have a little bit more to go. And for students who are struggling with sustaining their attention, it's really helpful to have some sort of positively reinforcing activity at the end that ties to your lesson. That today, the kids were so looking forward to playing this sentence game. And, we had to get through a whole slew of different events. And if we see some off-task behaviors, we just reference back, oh, we're only at 3. We really want to get down to this star and be able to play this game. We've also noticed that this really helps students pair the task with the purpose. So making our youngest learners really metacognitive and being able to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So if I have them read a story about our famous character, Nat the cat, because we only know short vowel A and about 10 consonants. So Nat the cat is one of the main people in my life. And Nat the cat, if we are doing an aim and agenda, when we read our story, I will have students check their understanding. That will be on my aim and agenda. And when I tell them to check their understanding, that means they're making a movie in their brain. So they're drawing then an illustration of what they learned. So we're not working on our artistic ability at this time. We're looking to see if what we read independently is matching the meaning of the story. So I often goof with them and I'll pull down a fancy smartboard slide and I'll say, did you see Nat swimming in the story? And there's a lot of different cat memes out there, so I've found some great ones of cats flying, and it really just helps to engage the students, but also, again, reference the aim and agenda in that what we're doing when we're checking our understanding, strong readers are making a movie in their brain. They're making a visual, and that is then giving them something that they can relate to and then employ at home when they're doing their homework and generalize those skills, throughout the content area.
Okay, another very, very key part of helping students build executive functions is explicitly teaching organizational strategies. So middle school and high school teachers, we all know this person over here. Ideally, right, we're trying to move them into this more organized locker and organized system. And organization does not come as an inherent skill to many students. And so it's important to make sure that you are working to create organizational systems and strategies that can help students throughout the day and during class. So in order to help students develop these organizational skills, it is really essential to build in time throughout the day. So whether that's one-to-one support, you're sitting with the student and talking through different ways that they can store information in the folder. Again, it's part of what Erica was saying earlier is it's really this sort of metacognitive piece. So why am I organizing things in this particular way? How can I organize things in a particular way? So it can be something as basic as like a think aloud. So something along the lines of, oh, we just finished our independent reading, so where would I put the book after I finished independent reading? What makes sense as a place that I would put that book? Or again, sitting with students and talking through the organizational systems that you have and building them into your class time. So not having it as like an afterthought, like, oh, I just handed back all this homework, shove it into the binder, but being really clear in, oh, you received homework, a good place to put this would be behind the homework tab in the binder that we use during class. A system that we have found incredibly effective from the youngest students all the way through the oldest students at our school is color coding. So this might seem really basic, but it was very life-changing for many of our students. So having a system in your classroom where, for example, all of the things that are green relate to science, right? So you have a science folder and it's green. You have a binder and it's for science. You have a homework folder and it's green and it's for science can really help students cue this automaticity when they're creating organizational systems and filing information. We see students internalize this type of a strategy in a number of different ways. My students have a test tomorrow on the women's rights movement coming up, and yesterday we had a study day where we were explicitly talking through different strategies that they can use. And I had a student who raised her hand and she said, oh, Miss Seidel, do you have different colored note cards so that I can put different categories with different colored note cards to organize myself? And I had like exploded. And so she created a system for herself where she's, again, generalizing this skill of color coding. And so she had all of the vocab words were on blue note cards, everything about Susan B. Anthony was on pink, and she really created this system for herself using what she had been taught in this type of a context. And we see that a lot with students, especially students who will go to high school and they'll come back and talk to us about the things that they have used at their new school without any sort of guidance. Up here is another type of system that can be integrated into a classroom. We use a lot of calendars here, and this specifically is a project calendar because we have found that students who have weak executive functions can really struggle with what are considered long-term assignments. So that can be anything like a science fair project or a poster board you're asking them to make or a research paper that they're completing. And there is this piece, sort of what Will was referencing earlier, of like, how do I initiate this task? How do I get from A to B? And so by creating a project calendar, you can really help students think about how to organize, plan, and prioritize. So here, for example, students were doing a research paper on Thurgood Marshall, and so I helped guide them through the process of what each day was going to look like during class. And then when it got to the point where they were independently conducting a research paper, they used the model that I had given them. So again, going back to that really explicit modeling piece, and applied it to their own research paper. They referenced it during class. They created little mini to-do lists for themselves. This is not something that students just like came up with. It required a lot of time and really, really clear instruction and modeling to get them to a place where they were doing this sort of work independently. The other great thing with project calendars that we've found is that it can help with that shifting and that flexibility piece, because if you accomplish a whole lot on one day, that can change the way that your calendar looks or the way that the project is being done. And so it helps students sort of self-monitor and manage that on their own.
All right, so at Gateway, we are helping students with their executive functioning skills academically, but also socially. So it's really, really sweet, but many of my students use the AIM and agenda when they have play dates. This is totally unprompted, and they make their own AIM and agenda for their play date plan. So that's how much this has infused into their lives and has transferred over to the social piece. Here's an example of our lunch date schedule, but with also free time choice. So that's a pilot program we've rolled out this year. Students ranked different choices of classrooms they could go to with activities such as arts and crafts, building, go noodle time. So it was totally intrinsically motivated. We have this schedule in our classroom because, similar to unpacking, eating lunch requires a lot of executive functioning skills. So what is your goal? To eat, get your energy, and a lot of our kids, their goal is to get to free time as soon as possible. But we require them to pack up before they get there, which is really a little bit unfair of us, but we got that reinforcement piece, and it really helps our students. So again, I really wish that sometimes when I was at dinner, I had a little timer set, because I'm often the one who's still finishing while everyone's eating dessert. But I have noticed that a timer for our kids is really what helps them. So we set a time, this is your allotted eating minutes. Of course, they are allowed to continue to eat afterwards, but it just helps them to manage how much their time they have in terms of prioritizing, talking with friends, off-task behaviors. So they're really having to, again, employ those EF skills. And then they have to build in the time for packing up and then getting to their free time choice. So just this visual helps our students, again, for the planning and goal setting, to know where they're going every day. They really have independently been able to check this schedule and know kind of where they're headed. And I think that's a really incredible skill that they've built. And it's really something that positively affects them. Also, if you like to know what ghost pick is, that is something that we've built in as another positive reinforcement system. But students who have really shined throughout the week, we allow them to get that extra lunch date. But again, it's really underlying those executive functioning skills. So how we're setting them up for success to be able to meet the different expectations that we have for them. So the ghost pick is really a hot topic on Fridays. I'm looking forward to this one. And this is just another example of how we would structure something so that we can help our students really maximize their executive functioning skills from a social perspective.
Oh, yeah, I can actually mention something about
Yeah.
timers. Erica talking about the timer reminded me that we had mentioned it a little bit earlier, and I think that in terms of utilizing a timer in your classroom, you really can never underestimate its benefits. This year I happened to have a particularly chatty group, and I noticed that it was taking them what I considered an excessively long time to complete our routine at the beginning of class. So things like taking out a pencil were paired with taking out a pencil, talking to the person next to me, talking to the person on the other side of the room, going to sharpen my pencil, all these things. And I walked by my colleague's classroom, and her students are like rapidly completing the routine. They're like so efficient. And I went to her and I said, what's happening in your classroom that's not happening in my classroom? And she's like, oh, we play beat the clock every day in order to complete the routine. And so she has a very visual timer, and this was life-changing for me. A visual timer, and it's set for a certain number of minutes, and it starts when the students walk in, and it helps students, again, with the time management piece and really making sure that they know how to prioritize and manage their time effectively, especially at the start of class. So
And again, just to circle back about what we were saying, in that we don't take anything for granted. So we are breaking up throughout the day what we need our kids to be able to do throughout a lesson, throughout when they arrive, when they depart. And something that, you know, some of our students struggle with is really as discrete as sitting in a chair. So we found that if we use a lot of language to elicit certain behaviors, such as if I were to spit out, please have your bottom on your chair, eyes up at me, feet flat. For students who struggle with processing language, I've lost them, and especially with working memory demands. So we have a lot of terms in the lower gateway school that also flow into the middle school that cue a certain set of behaviors. So we're really explicitly teaching into this at the beginning of the year. So when a teacher asks you to sit in learning position, you know exactly what that means. This visual is up at the board for those students who may still need to look at it, but it means all of those things I said before, without placing that demand on the child to have to process it. So we might do a learning position scan across the room, and kids sit on up, and it's really a beneficial tool that we've just found throughout academic, social, different pieces of the day is really helpful to just have a verbal or a visual cue mean a certain set of behaviors. So what do we want the child to exhibit? Just put it in a little chunk, and every teacher uses it, so really all of the kids know what's expected of them at specials, if they're visiting another teacher, and it's incredibly powerful for them.
So as mentioned sort of at the beginning of our portion of this presentation, is that everything that we are trying to do here is building students this point of gradual independence. So another way that we or that you can do this in your own classrooms is to incorporate things like checklists into assignments. So for example, up here we have it's a set of comprehension questions, and you'll notice that we're also employing a number of different strategies that are utilized throughout the day. So things like bolding or underlining key terms to help students access that information. Like, oh, okay, I have to restate the question. Highlighting really key and important information. Again, these are all visual cues that help our students process the information and make sure that they're completing all of the tasks necessary to be successful on assignments. The other thing that you'll see up here that can also be useful when you have students who are struggling with managing their time or prioritizing is having students write in what time they started assignments, completed assignments, and then the total time. So if the assignment is supposed to take 20 minutes, and what we've found also is that students are very honest with this. Like, you'll have students hand something in, they'll write like 3 minutes for a 25-minute assignment. And that can really be an invitation to talk to them about how to manage time, how do you break this task down, what did you need to do differently. Also, you'll see a checklist. Again, I use complete sentences, I added details, and this might seem like we're just reiterating the same sorts of things over and over again, but this is how students with weak executive functions can really internalize the types of things that they need to do on assignments and generalize this across the board. This is another example of a homework response checklist. So something like this can be individualized for a student. It can be put on the back of an assignment, at the bottom of an assignment. This one is obviously much less language heavy. And so things like, I've included a heading. Again, this is the self-monitoring piece. So did I do all the aspects and the parts of this assignment that I needed to do in order to get complete credit? And so we've used this with students before, and then eventually we'll pull away the scaffold once they start to demonstrate that they are able to complete all of these tasks on each of their assignments. This last one goes with our theme of gradual independence. And so you'll see up here, dear, insert your name, I wasn't able to complete my homework last night because I had trouble doing it by myself. I would like some extra help from you to understand this. Thank you. So this is something that we've used with younger students and also students who can be particularly anxious about managing that type of teacher interaction. And so something like this can help students from approaching you at the wrong time. So if you're in the middle of a lesson and they're blurting out that they didn't know how to do their homework the night before. Or the kid whose dog ate their homework, right? So all of these things here are different strategies and tools that you can build in that help students move from that teacher-centered piece all the way to the student-centered independent phase. So, are there, okay, so before I guess we take questions, we have a really quick little turn and talk for you. So find someone friendly nearby and turn and talk. And what is one strategy that you can begin using in your classroom to support students who need executive function support?
Yeah, so I can Oh, great. Is it private practice? Oh,
Anybody want to share anything they discussed with their partner?
So there's some things that's said about the color coding. In our classroom, we already do color coding. I go to the extent of laminating every type of piece, like the composition notebook, the folder. So we already have established as a school, yellow is always writing, blue is always math, and red is always reading. So I went ahead and created actual pictures of the actual notebooks that they have and put it, so every time we transition from period to period, we already have that picture. They already know why I need a pencil. I have a laminated like copy picture of pencil there. So using that really, and I started that this year, and it really makes a difference from, and I'm a freshman teacher, teaching up last year, so this year it's like, what are they, oh gosh, they already know Miss Gomez, can I go ahead and put it with what I'm writing now, and let me put it up there. And I mean, they can't reach, but they're just like so excited.
That's great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yes.
Yep.
I like the idea of the calendars. You have the goals and then you work backwards. And I think, because I teach English and I like to assign essays and projects because I like to make students sweat. But I definitely do want to incorporate, because I do that myself, but like, I do want to teach them how to incorporate that to any lesson structure.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I have a question about that.
Sure.
Like if you're working in a third grade class and really the teacher is the one who has decided what the steps of the writing project are going to be, it still occurs to me that it might be helpful for the kids to actually see how that looks, and not like, they have no idea what the long-term thing looks like, even if they're not
Absolutely.
planning it.
Yes, absolutely, and modeling it for them, and I think that's similar to the aim and agenda. It's like you made the plan for the class, but they need to know what it is.
Yeah.
You know, you can do that with a long-term project so that they know what is coming, and so they're also starting to sort of realize like, oh, when my teacher plans, this is how she does it. So if I need to make a plan, I can do the same thing. It's great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll throw one out there. I guess one thing I can do is give one student the checklist and the other student the task. And one student to be very visual checklist with each boxes and everything. And if one student does the task, the other student checks the checklist. And in addition to breaking down the task, it also helps with their metacognitive skills because one has to literally practice pausing and checking how far along we are with the task.
Yeah, absolutely. This is essential for group work, that you show the kids how to work together and how to organize who's doing what, giving jobs and those kinds of things.
Holds them accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else?
I know that some schools use an online system where a teacher, like a science teacher, does science labs on in advance. So kids that have language issues can preview it over the weekend before they're actually going into the labs, so they don't waste all that time trying to make sense of the language. But I guess it depends on whether or not you think having a parent that is also involved is helpful or not.
Yeah. What's interesting about the learning management systems, we don't use them here, but we introduce students to them before they go off to high school. And what's so fascinating is kids come back and they're like, oh, well, I figured out how to go in and color code all my assignments and schedules. So they're, again, applying what they were doing here with having color-coded folders that were tangible, and now going into those learning management systems and color coding all parts of that to help them sort of organize. Independently. So, you know, and kind of collaborating with parents on that can be very helpful too, to sort of gear them up to say things like, here's how you can help your student carry over some of what they've learned in my class or some of the structures that we have here, and really talking to the kids about why you're doing what you're doing.
I think that's something that really stood out, that I come from a school that was a responsive classroom. And responsive classroom is like, we don't take anything for granted. We basically show the kids exactly what the expectation is, and if they don't know, let me show you how it looks like. So having that again, it takes away from you getting because naturally when they don't do it, you're like, oh. But if you say, well, hold on, let me show you how to do it, and that definitely takes away, and kids are now like, oh, the moment they see their walking feet, marshmallow feet, whatever it is cutesy that you add on to the, to that task.
I want to know what the middle school version of marshmallow feet is. If somebody has that term, I need it really bad. I haven't figured out what's the cutesy way to say that to a 13-year-old. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
When I was teaching, I had a goal where I taught the students to, they would write their own goal. I will complete 3 pages in 20 minutes of a given assignment. And it was amazing when they wrote their own goal, rather than giving the 3 pages, these are the things you have to do, they wrote them. And then they could get it done with focus.
Yeah, especially if they've sort of learned the structure of doing that in advance. So a lot of times what teachers do here is have the kids write the aim and agenda, or talk about, this is the aim, what will the agenda be? So again, the gradual release. You see the aim and agenda at every single class, every day. So you get to the point where they kind of know it, and then they can start writing it, and then, so what would your aim and agenda be for your homework? Why don't you try that? So that they can sort of learn to sort of structure it themselves.
So I have a question. In terms of like, you have amazing strategies to help these kids. When, for myself, when I'm in a classroom, time is of an essence. So how did you find, because again, everything needs to be explicitly taught, and here you have, in our school we have a scope and sequence where we need to get to every single part of math, reading, writing. How does that play into your school, or how can that be supported to us, so that when we go back to say, hey, this was amazing, this worked in the school, can we try it? How does time, how do you manage time with everything else? Because showing a child how to unpack and have that very, first grade, having that schedule would be amazing. But again, let me show you how to do it at the beginning of the year, but what if they, so the time.
I guess my sense is that, and if anybody wants to jump in, please do. My sense is that it saves time in the long run.
Yes.
Right, so when you're explicit in the beginning, then everybody knows, and then most of the kids can kind of do their thing, especially if you're in a mainstream classroom, and then the kids who really need the support, those are the ones that you're coming back to. And you're coming back to those kids anyways, whether they're laying on the floor, flicking something across the room because they don't know what they should be doing, or whether you're coming to kind of check in with them and monitor and cue them back to that agenda or that visual. So I think the way we view it is you invest the time up front so that they know exactly what to expect and what is expected of them so that they can then, right. Anyone else? Sure.
It's okay to ask another question. So whenever I'm working with on my students' executive functioning skills, well, one of the ways I think about executive functioning is the voice in your head telling you you have something to do and what it is.
Yes.
And so you see these people in life who have this incredible voice in their head and they don't really need these systems. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's ultimately the goal, but I do often wonder, am I trying to help students compensate for a weak voice? Or am I trying, and these are systems that will be with them for life, or right now am I trying to help scaffold them with systems to strengthen that inner voice? And I just wonder if you can talk about that balance and the ultimate goal we're trying to lead students toward.
Yeah. I think it's the latter in the sense that by providing the scaffold, they build the voice in their head. They're always probably going to need some supports if they truly have a deficit in executive functions. However, as Erica shared at the beginning, you start to get self-aware and you realize, I do this instead of this. I wish you had your notebook with you because Erica's notebook is the most beautifully organized, color-coded thing. It's a work of art, and there's a pouch with markers of every color next to it, and that's what works for her. And that's a scaffold, that's a system that she's put in place for herself, and in having it, is able to organize on her own, right? So you by doing all of these things with students and modeling it for them, you make them more self-aware of what is helpful to them, and then hopefully they start to generalize and it becomes a little more automatic. That's the goal. So for example, going back to the word problem example, Valerie was talking about, giving a checklist to solve the word problem. Well, ultimately, we want them to be able to solve the word problem without the checklist. Is every kid going to be able to do that? I don't know. But if you do the checklist enough times, then maybe you can start to do your own checklist, and then maybe you only need a checklist for certain parts of it that you always forget to do, and then maybe you don't need a checklist at all because it's completely internalized. And that's different for every kid. Our goal at this school is for students to generalize the skills and the strategies so that they can be strategic, independent learners when they leave here. Everybody's on their own journey towards that, so it varies for different students. But ultimately, we hope that students graduate kind of knowing where they are on that journey and what their toolbox is of supports. And oftentimes, around October, these kids who've graduated and are freshmen are calling, they're like, hey, what's that outline? Or, Miss Seidel, can I have that thing that we did last year for that project? Can you just remind me what it was? Of course we send it with them all packaged up when they graduate, but, there's one or two that sort of lost that toolkit and executive functions. And, but realize that worked for me. There was a thing that worked for me. Let me go back to my resources, and I know who my resource is and how to find her to ask for it. So I think ultimately you are trying to get them to generalize as much as possible, but maybe not everything. And I think the gradual release is sort of key to that. Knowing when you feel like they got it, then pulling back a piece.
Also, I guess I would add to that, it's really building up their strengths. There's some kids that are just going to need sort of supports going through, lower school or elementary, middle school, college, high school, college. They're going to need these supports. So the idea is to strengthen, really sort of strengthen their strengths and make them aware of where the challenges are. That's probably more important.
I do think a lot of times, though, one of the things that's important is to, we sort of make a lot of these things mandatory. So for example, we have a very specific folder system used for homework. We have a parent here tonight who can tell you that it's a lovely little system. And a lot of kids, you know, are like, I don't want to use the thing that you're giving me because it's, you know, middle school and that's what they're supposed to do. And it's like, no, you're going to use it. We're going to talk about why you need to use it. And then by the end, they love this thing, and it's their favorite item because, not by the end, probably a week in, it's their favorite item because they realize, oh my gosh, I don't lose my homework anymore. So really requiring kids to use the strategy and giving them feedback on their use of the strategy is really, really important. If you make it optional, like you can use the checklist if you want, or you can estimate how long the homework assignment is going to take if you want, it's less likely that it's going to happen. So requiring them to use the strategy and assessing them, giving them feedback on their use of strategies is really essential to, again, the motivation, internalizing it, making sure that it's done consistently. If you only do it every once in a while, it's less likely to be utilized and internalized successfully. Your question? Anybody else?
So I have a question, just when you said to focus on their strengths, do you mean from an organizational standpoint, or are you talking about more subject matter standpoint?
I was just thinking in terms of executive function skills. Some people have great memories, but they're super disorganized, or it could be vice versa. Some people are great at self-monitoring, but they have other issues going on. But I think part of it is looking at what they're good at, right, and really making sure that we continue to build that up, because they might need to lean on that, because of weaknesses in other skills. I mean, we have kids that may be sort of really, really bright, but they just work really slowly. That's okay. So we build in things to make sure that they get the time that they need to show how smart that they are. So it's really sort of noticing what the kid is good at and making sure you use that.
Yeah, I want to talk about pulling scaffolds back and letting it be more independent, and I guess maybe come out with some their own strategies or maybe metacognition that works. This is a very metacognition.
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of it has to do with sort of trial and error. But when you see that they're utilizing a strategy or a skill pretty consistently, then you can try to pull it back. So going back to that example of what we use to organize homework, once we feel like kids get it, and we trust that they understand how it's being used, we can start to have conversations about what's a system that you would use if you didn't show up at school and somebody gave you a system. How would you use what we do here to form your own system? So that's another project we do with our 8th graders. It's like, okay, you don't have to carry around our organizational system anymore. What will yours be when you leave here? And so giving them an opportunity. So sometimes it's really intentional, teaching something, seeing that they've gotten it, and then giving them some sort of experience to try something else. And I think it's also when you see them doing the work and you're noticing, okay, this kid does it every time. They use the checklist every time. Let me just try to pull back one piece. Or having a conversation with them and saying, you feel like you got this. Sometimes they let you know because they just stop using it, but they're still completing the work successfully. So then it's a conversation of, I noticed you didn't use the checklist for last night's homework. What's up? And they'll probably say, I don't really need it anymore. And it's like, okay, great. So it's kind of trial and error in some degree, and also sort of assessing their successful implementation of whatever it is that you've taught them.
I think they've internalized it so much that they've already used it, that it's embedded in their brain where they don't need it anymore because that's what they use.
Yeah, and there's some things that, you're never going to stop using an aim and agenda even though they understand aim and agenda, right? Because every lesson benefits from an aim and agenda. So they've internalized it, they can write them, they can talk about them, they'll call you on it if you're not using it, but you still will use it because it's helpful. So there's that other piece to it. Like you're always going to have an organizational system, it just might not be this one. All right, Slate, you've probably all worked. The Gateway folks are going to hang around a little bit if you have more questions or want to talk or learn a little more about Gateway. I think our Selective folks are going to hang out too, so we're going to talk to them. Thank you.